welcome back. It's good to see everyone again, and I'd firstly like to thank everyone who's subscribed to the channel for supporting us. In this video we're going to look at a number of things that happen in the field when we're capturing images that drive us crazy. And it all relates to how the camera communicates with us. And we rely so much on the information on the back of the camera, and that's where our problems begin. So when we're viewing the image on the back of the camera, what are we actually seeing? And the first of these problems is that we're not actually viewing the raw file that the camera is capturing. What we're seeing is a JPEG compressed image that has reduced color and reduced dynamic range. So what the camera is telling us can be quite often misleading and sometimes outright wrong. As you can see in this image here, it's showing me that the highlights are clipped. But when I load that image into Lightroom and examine it, often I'll find that there's no clipping of highlights at all. So let's have a little bit of a dive deeper into why this happens, and we'll need to go back to the studio to do that. So here we are back in the studio, and as we said, the first problem is that when we look at the image on the back of the camera, it's not the same as when we open the file in Lightroom. And that, as we said, is because the image that you're looking at on the back of the camera is a lower resolution JPEG file created by the camera as it records the file. And when you open the image in Lightroom, you're looking at the raw file with some default settings applied. So they're actually quite different things. And so one of the problems is the image on the back of the camera, you have a screen that's only about 2 million pixels, whereas the camera might be recording a 45 megapixel image. It can't possibly display all that information on the back of the camera. Whereas when you open the file in Lightroom, it reads that whole file and generates a thumbnail, again based on some default setting, and certainly not the optimum, but it generates an image based on the image as recorded by the camera. So firstly, we're looking at two different things. But another reason behind these things looking a little bit different is that sometimes we have a little bit of different expectations. When we look at an image through the viewfinder, let's say a scene like a beautiful landscape, our mind fills in the way that we would like the image to look. And so we see a fairly bland image on the back of the screen or in Lightroom when we first open it. But of course our mind imagines the final processed image that has been adjusted and optimized to the way we want it to look. So our expectation is a little bit different too. And of course, when we're looking at that image on the screen on the back of the camera, we're also looking at a JPEG image that's in a smaller color space than is available for our editing software. And of course, we don't know what reproduction quality the screen has on the back of the camera. It's just designed to make the image look good so that we're happy and then move on to make the next image. And of course, things like the white balance will be what the camera thought at the time, and that may or may not be correct. And when we look at the other problems that we get to later on, we'll see that this all stems from the way that the camera has produced that JPEG. So as we look at the image on the back of the camera, we have to give some thought as to how much we can rely on that, because it's not going to give us an accurate representation of our image. And of course, in extreme lighting situations, it's going to give you a vastly different impression of what the image is going to look like. And here's a couple of extreme examples. One where this is the image captured, and then of course how we visualize the image when it's been processed. So we can't rely fully on the image on the back of the screen. We can only use that as a guide. Sometimes it's a good guide, other times it's really only going to give us a few basic indications. So what we need to think about is how our camera captures the image. And of course, the problem is the camera is a dumb instrument. It can't really see what you're photographing. It can only respond to measurements of light based on how the manufacturer determines the exposure. And it doesn't know anything about the image content. It doesn't know whether you're photographing a polar bear in the Arctic or a bride in a wedding dress. They both have light and dark tones, but they're vastly different images. And it has no understanding of what it is that it's photographing. So we have to rely on using our brains to instruct the camera how to operate. So the camera just measures light, and it responds to light in accordance with the way the manufacturer has programmed it to look. And what it considers correct exposure may or may not be correct, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, some people will say, yes, but these new cameras, they can detect eyes, and so obviously they must be able to detect faces and things. Well, no, the camera's been programmed to recognize a shape that we call eyes, but all it does is measure contrast and things that we call eyes, but it doesn't really understand things any more than your dog can understand the movements of the stock market. It's something totally alien and outside the ability of the camera to do anything like that. And this brings us on to the second problem that's related really to the first problem, and that is the information displayed on the screen is not accurate. And I call this the camera lies to you. And that is that sometimes what it's showing you on the display on the back of the camera just isn't true. Sometimes you look at an image and you'll see flashing highlight warnings here in this simulated example, and you think, wow, I've blown my exposure, it's wrong, I've got burnt out highlights. And yet when you open that same file in your editing software and have a look at it, you'll see that, well, hang on a minute, there's plenty of headroom in that histogram, it's not overexposed at all. This is a simulated example, it's not the real image, but you'll get the point. And this is the problem. The default settings of Lightroom are reading the raw data, whereas the image on the screen is that compressed JPEG. And to understand why that is different, we need to have a little think about how the camera makes that JPEG. And we need to understand how the images are recorded. And one of the most fundamental things is that a raw file as captured is not a viewable image. It's a bunch of data that needs to be processed by software that understands that data before it can be turned into a viewable image. And to provide the viewer or the photographer with something that they can respond to on the back of the camera, back in the early days of photography, it was decided that the only file formats were available was JPEG or TIFF, and the easy way to do it was just to create a JPEG thumbnail. And as images are recorded, the data is written to the camera, and then the camera software does some work. And one of the things is that the camera sensor is only measuring one of the three channels. Each of the pixels in your camera only measures either red, green or blue light. And so that the image that is collected, or the data that is collected, doesn't really form a viewable image as such. And if you were to look at it somehow, looking at that data, you would really just be looking at a monochrome image based on luminance values that each of those pixels recorded. And the clever thing is that in software, those three channels of differing colors are combined into a viewable image that has a red, green and blue value for each and every pixel. And that's where the clever part of the software comes into it. And so after the image has been processed, which we call demosaicing, the colors and the details are combined into a default view in the software. And this is the differing paths that the information takes. If we look at the sensor captures the data, and then inside the camera there's some processing done by the camera software, and it creates that JPEG thumbnail. But what we see when we open in Lightroom is the actual raw data. So just reinforcing that, we're looking at two very different things, and depending on the camera manufacturer, the JPEG will look quite a bit different from the raw file. And that's not to be unexpected, because each camera manufacturer has their own way of looking things. And of course, back in the old days of low resolution digital capture, there was no need for anything other than that. So let's have a look a little bit further on how we can interpret that information. And of course, one of the problems is that when we're looking at a JPEG file, it is only an 8-bit file, which means that there is a maximum of 256 levels of tone, whereas a raw file is either 12 or 14-bit, depending on the capture method. So In compressing all that raw data down into a JPEG file, you're really only viewing about 5% or less of the data that's captured. And of course in Photoshop we tend to work in a 16-bit file, which for the geeks amongst you is really only a 15-bit file plus 1. But we're still talking about 32,000 odd possible steps in tone, whereas a JPEG image has only got a maximum of 256 steps. So there's quite a lot of data compression. And you're really only looking at a very small portion of your image. And of course, depending on how your computer screen is calibrated, the colors are going to look much different. And a JPEG file is either in Adobe RGB or sRGB color, and those color values are quite different from what they would be in a larger color space. So we have a number of different issues there to contend with, and there's no surprise then really that the image on the back of the camera can look quite different from what you look at when you get the image into software. And one last thing, that while we're still talking about the image on the back of the camera, it's a common misconception amongst non-photographers that there's only one way to process an image that you record on your camera. And of course that's so far from the truth that it's not funny. Leaving the processing to an in-camera JPEG is just leaving it, as Les Walkling says, leaving it to the dude in the white coat inside your camera to decide how your image is going to look. The only problem being the camera doesn't know what you've photographed. So sometimes a JPEG will look okay, other times not. But if you don't handle the processing of your image, someone else will, and that someone else probably isn't going to make the right decisions about your image. So the problem is, how do we evaluate exposure and even the image when we look at the back of the camera? We know that the histogram isn't necessarily accurate and the colors maybe aren't accurate, but there are a few things we can evaluate: the framing, the focus point, the more or less depth of field and other aspects. But with things like exposure, we have to use a little bit of judgment. And when we see an image on the back of the camera that's not displaying any clipping, we're fairly safe. But what happens then if you see something like a little bit of clipping in the image and you get it into Lightroom and there's still a bit of clipping there? Well, the thing is, a little bit of minor clipping in an image can be rectified in processing by adjusting the whites and the highlights. And so don't be too concerned if there's a little bit of clipping showing on your image. That's usually recoverable or not even a problem when you get it into Lightroom. And a bit of experience will help teach you how to respond to what the camera is telling you, and you will need to use a little bit of interpretation to understand what you need to do and when and where you need to bracket your images. And so we come to the question of, do we need to bracket our exposures? Some people think that they need to do that with every single photograph they take, but that's just simply not true. In most cases, the dynamic range of the camera will be more than capable of handling the brightness range in a given image. Unless you're photographing at midday in a bright sunny situation where you have deep shadows and very bright highlights, most cameras will be capable of rendering the full tonal range. Now let's take an example here of an image photographed in Tasmania. I made two exposures here of an early morning camera shoot with dawn as the sun rose over the horizon. This one was exposed for the foreground and this one was exposed for the bright lights, and they were then combined into an HDR in Lightroom. And this is a fairly extreme situation where you had a very bright sun on the horizon and some very deep shadows. But the difference in exposure here, there were only two shots used, was to make about a 1 1/3 stop difference in the exposure. And you'll notice here our old friend sensor dust has come into the image, and that can be rectified fairly simply. So HDR, yes, in some circumstances it's necessary to bracket your exposures, but in a lot of cases it's not necessary to go to extreme lengths to shoot multiple images at different exposure settings. Often just two will be more than enough. And so we come to the question of, well, how do we evaluate color on the back of our screen? Well, of course, the simple answer is you really can't. There are so many variables with colour that the best you can hope for is to get a well-exposed image, and then we can adjust the colour. Let's just have a look at this sunset image, the DNG created from the two images combined. And how do we evaluate the colour? Well, we can take the as shot white balance and have a look at that. That looks acceptable. But what about if we balanced it for daylight? Different again. Is it right? Is it wrong? It's a matter of personal taste. Or what about if we assumed it was a cloudy day? All sorts of different options. And of course we can go back to our custom settings and adjust it to suit the way we feel that the image ought to look. And of course, with this early morning sun, there was quite a lot of pink and magenta in the sky, so that there should be some magenta reflected into the rocks. So what is the right colour for an image? You really can't determine that until you've processed the image in your software. So don't even think about trying to evaluate colour on the back of the camera. And so we now come to the third problem, and that is we see distractions in the image when we open it up in our software, and yet we think when we compose the image that there was nothing there. And this is particularly true of things like macro lenses and telephoto lenses used at a long length. And what happens is that we tend to focus on, and pun intended, the area that we're trying to get our focal point on, and generally because we're looking through the lens with the lens wide open, and that applies both to mirrorless and to DSLRs, you're not really going to see the distractions in the background because we're focused on one point where we're setting the focus point of the camera, and we're critical about how we set that up, and yet when we open the image later on we see all sorts of distractions. And that's because our eyes also only have a very shallow, sharp point, and as we concentrate on the part of the image that we're looking at, we don't see all that stuff in the background until we look at the image on the back of the camera or get it back into software later on. And this is a real problem, but it's not a problem with the camera, it's a problem with the way we use the information. And of course, the problem is that the camera doesn't understand what we're focusing on or what we're photographing. We set the focal point on one part of the image, the camera records the data, and the lens does its best to render everything as sharply and beautifully as possible. And does the camera create those distractions? No, of course, they're already there, but it's just that we don't see them. And as, of course, we use our DSLR, we step down to look at the depth of field using the preview button, the image gets very dark, and often we just can't see what's in the background. And the problem with mirrorless cameras is that you just can't see. There's no way to preview the depth of field. The only way you can do that is take an image and then look at the image on the back of the camera. So to simulate how the depth of field preview would look, let's have a look at this image of the tree with the sunrise. I think I called it a sunset before. It's a sunrise in eastern Tasmania. Here's the image with the adjustments. But if we were looking at this in situ and I wanted to preview the depth of field to see if this foreground was sharp as well as the background, something like this is all I would see. And it would stop down so dark that I probably really can't evaluate anything of any use. So you might be forgiven for thinking that looking at the image on the back of the camera is totally useless. But of course, it can be quite valuable, and it is a guide as to what you've been capturing. But you shouldn't rely on the colour or the exposure. But there are some things that is really good for evaluating. Things such as the focus or the sharpness of the image. Zooming into the focus point should give you a good idea. The depth of field preview should give you a good indication. Framing, what you've captured in the frame, and of course any movement. If you're deliberately doing a slow exposure, it will give you a very good indication obviously of the movement in the image and so forth. So it's not a total waste of time, but you need to understand that you have to do some interpretation. And so this brings us along to problem number 4, and that is that sometimes the camera's light meter just doesn't give us the right exposure. And we know that we can't rely on the image on the back of the camera or the highlight warnings, and so this can be a problem, and we really have to use a little bit of judgment here. And even with the fancy metering modes that modern cameras display, with all of the programming and so forth, there are still situations where the exposure reading is going to be wrong. And let's take a little example here. Typically in a lot of landscapes we have the situation where the sky is much brighter than the landform, and so often the camera's meter will expose for those highlights and protect those, but at the cost of the shadows, whereas what you really wanted to photograph was the full range of tones. And you may then have a situation where you've got to make some adjustments. And this is not an unusual situation. A lot of landscape photography, we have this issue. And of course, when you get into situations that are a little bit outside the ordinary, average scenes are handled very well by cameras, but when you get into unusual lighting situations like this one inside a monastery in Tibet, whereas the light is coming from one small area, it's very dark, and there's also an extreme color cast, the camera's meter was all over the place. And things like photographing in the Arctic or Antarctic, where you have large expanses of white, your camera is not going to expose correctly. So let's take a situation where we have an albatross against a dark background, and what happens there is that the dark background is going to fool the exposure meter, because the camera thinks that in any given image there's going to be a range of tones from dark to light, and it will tend to try and balance the middle tone to middle grey. And because this one has a predominance of dark tones, it's tried to overexpose the image, and therefore in processing, as long as our highlights are not blown out, we can bring this exposure back to be what it should be. But of course, without knowing for sure, with the highlights on the back of the camera, you're a little bit in the dark. And is it the camera's fault that we don't always get the exposure right? Well, of course, it's up to us to know if we've got it right, and we need to use some judgment. So let's look at a couple of examples. And looking at another situation where we have a very bright overall scene, the camera is going to tend to render this scene a little bit underexposed, and so that you will need to make some adjustments in processing to increase the exposure, or in the field adjust your exposure into the plus, and it could be as much as a 1 or a 1.5 stop increase in exposure. So evaluating exposure depends a little bit on experience, as well as understanding how the camera's meter operates. And now this brings us to problem number 5, and our last one that we're going to look at today, and that is sometimes the white balance is way off. If you're using auto white balance on your camera and we're recording a raw file, yes, of course the white balance is not set, but it starts off as the default view when you open it in software. And what happens is that average scenes are handled well, but when we get into some tricky situations where the lighting is different, the white balance can be way off. So let's just have a quick look at a couple of examples here. This scene captured in Tasmania, in the rainforest. You have some very vibrant greens, and what happens is the camera's white balance looks at this and thinks, oh dear, there's way too much green here, I need to change the white balance to increase magenta. And you'll see here in the white balance as shot, it's showing a dramatic amount of magenta, and it's just not the right sort of processing for this image. And if we move over to the image where I've corrected the white balance as well as done some other exposure treatments, you'll see here I've brought the white balance back from plus 40 odd magenta back to something that's a lot more reasonable. And so we've brought back our greens to their vibrancy and taken off that really strong cast out of the image. So when you get into extreme situations, you will get extremely different images. And in situations like this, where you're photographing something under the open sky, where you're not in direct sunlight necessarily, you will see scenarios where the sky has thrown out very blue reflections in the image, and you need to correct that. And by doing that in the processing, we can change the white balance and the color temperature to eliminate that blue cast. So in a lot of situations, the white balance is going to be fine and you can adjust it to suit, but in extreme situations it's going to be way off and you have to intervene. And the best thing to do is to evaluate it on a calibrated screen where you can decide how the colors should look, and that's the only judgment you really need to make. So when we looked at those other images with the sunrise, we looked at a few different white balance settings. It's really down to the person creating the photograph to decide how the image should look. So, is it the camera's fault if the white balance is a bit off, or is it just down to us to evaluate the scene and make our own decision? At the end of the day, it's just a question of you deciding what you want the file to look like. So you're the photographer. You decide what the colour should be, what colour range, what colour space, how much sharpness, how much contrast, and the overall tonality of the image. It's up to you to instruct the camera to record what you want. Your camera is not an idiot, it's just a tool. So now let's have a quick look at how to take charge of your camera and understand that it has some shortcomings, but you as the photographer can instruct it what to do. Firstly, obviously we don't believe always when it tells you the highlights are clipped. Learn how to evaluate the exposure based on experience, the histogram, and nothing can outweigh a lot of experience and learning from looking at images on the camera and getting them back into software. And when you see an image, something like this, where there's a little bit of clipping, it's quite possibly okay. But if you look at an image that has a huge amount of clipping showing on the back of the camera, that's probably not okay, and you need to do some rethinking. So a bit of experience goes a long way. And remember, of course, that when we're looking at exposure, average scenes are exposed averagely well, and unusual scenes obviously don't always work. So a scene with excessively bright or white scenes, the camera will tend to underexpose the image because it wants to take that middle tone to grey, so you need to increase the exposure. And a scene like this iceberg we looked at earlier, the camera would tend to underexpose because it's a bright scene. It wants to render the middle tone grey, and so you would need to increase the exposure setting on your camera. In other words, go into the plus. And likewise, when you have a very dark scene, the camera will tend to overexpose if there's an excessive amount of dark areas, so you need to decrease the exposure. For the same reason, it's trying to render the middle tone grey. So in this situation here, we had a lot of dark rock in the foreground, and that threw the meter out, and so you needed to reduce the exposure, go into the minus, and adjust the exposure accordingly. And of course, when we come down to those nasty distractions and surprises, we really don't have any other option but to use the depth of field to assist us, even though that's an imperfect method. Or if you're photographing in a situation like this where you have a tripod, take a test exposure, look at the image carefully on the back of the screen to look for annoying distractions in the background, and adjust the focus point or the aperture accordingly. And when it comes to things like the color and the white balance, what is white balance anyway? What is the correct white balance? We looked at this example or a similar example. As shot, if we changed it to daylight, we get a different look. If we changed it to shade, we get a different look again. And who's to say what's the right exposure and what's the right color balance? It's all in the eye of the beholder. So it's up to you to decide. And here's my wish list for improving cameras. Ideally, we'd like to be able to use the raw file to generate some sort of an image on the back of the camera with some sort of standard processing applied. But of course, this would really be difficult because although we'd eliminate this problem with the image on the back looking different, we'd need a lot more processing power in our camera, much better screens on the back, and that's probably not feasible at the moment. And of course, the second problem, the histograms, well, if we got the raw file to generate the histogram, we'd obviously be able to accurately evaluate exposure. But again, we need more processing power and speed. And a way to be able to preview the depth of field without the screen going too dark, well, really the only way that we can do that is make a test shot, view it on the back of the screen and evaluate it, and then take another shot. Now that doesn't help if you're hand holding in a situation where you can't replicate the scene, but that's the best we can do. and maybe it could be some fancy software done with mirrorless. I don't know, but at this stage we don't have an option. And if I was being a bit flippant, I'd say, well, to avoid having to get up in those cold early mornings and get out to get those sunrise shots, maybe it'd be nice to have some way of sending the camera out on its own and letting it do all the work for you. We do have the technology, but at the moment it's just a little bit expensive. And the last, but maybe not the least, is, well, what if you had some ideas, buttons on the back of the camera that would tell you how to treat a particular subject? That would make us photographers probably pretty much redundant. And finally, if you'd like to download and have your own copy of the notes relating to this important video, please go to the PhotoTutor website, www.phototutor.com.au, click on the Tutorials tab, scroll down past the YouTube video shortcuts to the box marked Image Capture, click on that box and you will see the introduction to this important section. Click on the Read More tab and you will be taken to a PDF document that is 18 pages of all the details and more of what I've covered in the video, and then it's yours to either download or print and easily save it as a PDF to save printing, and I hope it's useful for you. If you like this video, please hit the like button, give it a thumbs up, and please give us some feedback because it helps design future videos. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.